We haven't, so I'm not sure what's going to happen after that. I'm not the public speaker in my family. My dad is. So I'm just not, it's not quite a public speak, and I'm just going to share my story with you. Many of you who have been coming here for many years may know what it means if I say I'm Tracy's sister. I get to be Tracy's sister, and it's very exciting to be up here. If you've been coming just maybe since about 2000, you might know me as Cal and Jean Lehman's daughter. So I have a lot of titles like that, actually. I have a little boy, so when I go into his school, I get to be Lars' mom. And that's an awesome title. I'm Lars' mom. My husband had been in the plant that their church that we planted from, our church planted from, for probably 10, 12 years before we got married. So at church, I'm always Stephen's wife. And I like all these titles. I really do. I love being Tracy's sister, Cal and Jean's daughter, Lars' mom, and Stephen's wife. But several years ago, I got a new title. And I have to say, it's my favorite title. And that is, I am now a child of God. Amen. Wow. I'm ready. So this morning, what I would like to do is share with you how I became that, how God came and in his amazing, awesome grace gave me that new title as a child of God, because I love the other titles, but this one's my favorite. This is a little bit different to give, and it may be a little bit of a different perspective. You have heard some of the other testimonies. My parents gave theirs, and my sister gave hers. Mine may be a little different, so we'll see what happens. It's not easy to prepare a testimony based on everything you've been through when your family's all right here. I wouldn't trade it for the world, I really wouldn't, but it wasn't easy to word everything right, so let's just hope God's with me here. So when I was born, my parents were witnesses, and they had been for a while. My mom was on her side, we were third generation witnesses. My siblings and I were third generation, and my dad had been a witness for several years. I think I must have been a little bit of a surprise because my sisters were quite a bit older. They were already in school. They were 7 and 8 years old when I came along, so I think I was a bit of a surprise. But that's okay. When I was very young, my mom was able to be home with me. She was home with me, and the other kids were off at school, and my dad was working. And both of my parents, we were witnesses, but they really did share with me a love of God. We called him Jehovah. We referred to him as Jehovah, but there was this ultimate love of God. And yes, we had to go to the meetings, and we had to do this, we had to do that. But my mom and I would talk about how good God was and how he had created all the wonderful things. When we saw a pretty flower, she would say, well, God did that. Isn't that wonderful that God did that? And that Satan came along and kind of messed everything up. And so, even underneath the witness veil, there was this love of God. And this was something that was planted inside of me from a very young age. However, as I grew older, I had an older sister, and my sister hit her teenage years and a little bit before, and she has shared all of this before, so I'm not disclosing things that she hasn't really shared. But she decided to test out some things that some teenagers will. For the most part, it really was just smoking. And after the second time, she had been baptized, and after the second time, the elders decided in a meeting that my parents were not allowed to go into, they decided to disfellowship her. My sister was 13 years old. As I said, we were third generation witnesses on my parents' side. So in our congregation, it wasn't just all these people she had known all her life, although it was that, but it was also a lot of family. And all these people turned their back on a 13-year-old. To me, I was younger. I was about 7 when all of this started happening. So to me, my sister was older and really sophisticated and seemed grown up. Now I realize 13 is very young and just a child. Disfellowshipping is meant to be hard. It's not meant to be easy. It's meant to you shun that person, and with the hope that they will come back. So it's meant to be difficult and meant to be hard. It's hard for adults to go through this. I can't imagine what a 13-year-old child had to go through to deal with that. My parents did insist that if she were going to live at home, she would have to go to the meetings. That was their rule. We were witnesses, and at this time, my dad was an elder. So this is what we all had to do this. It was a requirement for all of us. But this was obviously very hard for her to walk into a place, these people she had known for her whole life, and her family didn't speak to her, not even her grandmother. And my grandmother lived just down the street, and we were close to her. So at some point, she stopped showing up. She stopped showing up after school on meeting nights and just stopped coming home. Around this time, somewhere in this year, my mother was pregnant, and then the next surprise came along. So it was a very stressful time for my parents. I remember many, many nights when I was 7 and 8 years old, when my parents would be out most of the night, maybe all of the night, looking and searching for my sister. Sometimes they would come home with her, and sometimes they didn't. And we never knew from one day to another whether she would be there or really what to expect at all. My parents obviously had a lot of things going on. They were either pregnant with or had a brand new baby, and they had a teenager who was, as things started spiraling down, kind of out of control. And especially from the way they looked at it, we were looking at it from the witnesses. And the witnesses had a way of dealing with this tough love. And my parents loved her so much, and you could tell, but it was a very difficult time. And there was a lot of anger in our house. There was a lot of stress and frustration in our house during these years. That year, I was 8 years old, and that fall I started into 3rd grade. My brother had been born in the summer, and these events were going on. It was a constant uproar. I tried to get by at school. I really did. I have my education degree, so I know now, looking back, 3rd grade is a huge transition year. It takes you from your early childhood years to your middle childhood years. Kindergarten, 1st and 2nd, they do a lot of hands-on. You learn by doing. You're usually, the reading's not enough to do dittos and all of that. But by 4th grade, you're using textbooks. So 3rd grade is a very big transition year. And many children can struggle in this under the best of circumstances. Nobody told me that. I didn't know that, and I really did struggle. I remember I would go and I would sit there, and I would sit in school, and it was as if they were speaking a different language. I didn't understand what the teachers were saying. I didn't understand what they expected. I sure didn't understand the papers they handed out to do. The words I could read, but those words looked like chicken scratch. I had no idea that, because things were stressful at home, it can really block off a child's ability to learn. I think the hardest thing is that nobody noticed. I don't think my parents could notice when they were out searching many, many nights, searching the streets for another child, or up all night with an infant. And no teacher noticed either. If any teacher said anything, it was, "You need to be here more. You need to be here more." So I felt like I was left to sink or swim, and I couldn't swim. I was 8 years old, and all these things were above my head. I could not reach them. I could not do them. So I was left to sink or swim, and I wasn't able to swim. They decided at that point to hold me back in 3rd grade. But every child knows what that means. That means you failed. You failed the 3rd grade, and I failed the 3rd grade. When that happened, everything was already stressed. I wasn't feeling real good about everything anyway. I took on a lot of shame. For me to have failed the 3rd grade was so shameful. I felt stupid and abandoned, and I felt ashamed. And these things stuck with me for a long time, and they really did play right into the witnesses' hands. They were exactly what could be used. Again, I think Lori mentioned, at a time you're vulnerable. And so I was vulnerable, and when you grow up as a witness, you kind of spend your life vulnerable. I began feeling like life was survival. Again, I was just trying to swim. I was just trying to keep things together. I was just trying to make it through that day, keep my head above water. It was survival, it felt like. Things could be really hard at home. There was fighting and worry. If Tracy was there, then there was a lot of friction and everybody was arguing. I understand why now, but there was a lot of friction and arguing. If she wasn't there, then my parents and my family were worried sick about her or trying to find a new treatment facility or visiting this treatment facility for her. I remember spending a lot of Saturdays. We did go out and service some Saturdays, but other Saturdays we went to visit her, and I would get something out of the vending machine. I'd be so excited to get those quarters to get something out of the vending machine at different facilities around our area. So there was a lot of stress and worry in our home. But we had to go to the meetings and really just pretend everything was just fine. I had a strong feeling that and children do this, it's not just my family or me, but children blame things on themselves, and I had this feeling that I had to keep things held together. I had, at 8 years old, to hold things together. If I slipped up, then they were going to get even worse, and they were bad enough, and I couldn't handle it if it got worse. I didn't know what worse would look like. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Ghost Dad, but in it, Bill Cosby's the dad. He's a single dad, and somehow he dies, but he doesn't completely leave the earth. And so he has these 3 kids, and somehow, I don't exactly know all the details, but he had this chance to come back. And he's trying to get his teenage daughter to hold things together so that when he comes back, they're not separated, they don't go live with relatives or anything. So this poor teenage daughter is trying to hold things together, but she wants to be a teenager. But there's this little girl, and she was 7 or 8, and she would go around and she'd go, "Everything is perfectly normal. Everything is perfectly normal," Her dad's dead, her sister's trying to keep it together. She's going, "Everything is perfectly normal." So that's what I felt, that I had to keep everything is perfectly normal, but it wasn't. As a child, and I think Toshi was referring to this a little bit this morning, children see things one way or the other. They see things black and white. And to me, I had that scripture, "Children, be obedient to your parents, for this is pleasing with the Lord." I heard this all the time. And it goes on to say that it may go well with you. Well, I had watched Tracy. She hadn't done what my parents said. She hadn't done what the congregation said, and therefore God, to me, had said. And she was going through some pretty bad consequences for that. I didn't have to learn from doing. I was going to do what I was supposed to do, what was expected of me. I learned very early just to do what I was told, and not rock the boat, because it was not safe to rock the boat. There's a lot of stress in that for a young child. There's a lot of stress. My dad was an elder, and so there was lots of stress in trying to do what's right. There was already this blemish on the family name, and I didn't want to do anything to add to that. So it also put my parents under a lot of stress. If you can imagine, I can't imagine trying to get my 8-year-old to sit still he does well in school, but after school all day to come home and try to sit for another 2 hours, I can't imagine. And so my parents were under a lot of stress trying to raise 4 children in trying to please an unpleasable religion. We had to do this, and I often felt as if I had to make up for the stress that was going on. When I would do what was right, I did. I saw my parents smile, and I saw a little bit of their stress relief, which, makes a kid feel good, and they want to do that, and I can understand their perspective too. But man, I put a lot of stress on myself to relieve this pain and to do what was right. Again, it was still this sink or swim type of feeling, this survival. Let me just make sure everything is okay for today. And this seemed to set a little bit of a pattern for my life. As I got older, though, this went on where the family was in chaos for several years. But as I got older, about 13, I chose on my own to get baptized. And although I really did know that this would please my parents, I didn't feel pressured into it. from the time I was little, I really did love God. And I was going to say at the beginning that my mom, when she gave her testimony, kept saying when I was real little, I would look for God. I wanted to find him. And she finally asked me why. It says to give him a hug. And I don't remember saying that, but I remember when she said we couldn't give him a hug because we can't touch him. I said, well, I want to send him a card. But I think it's unique that even from a young age, people have this draw to God, and yet there's this gap. And they want to bridge this gap. You automatically want to bridge this gap. And the witnesses don't give you a bridge for this. They don't give you any type of bridge or any way. Yes, you can love God, and you hope you're doing enough that he loves you. So when I was 13, I decided I wanted to get baptized. I wanted to give my life over to Jehovah God. I wanted to give it to God. I loved him with all my heart, and I felt as if baptism would bring pleasure to him. I remember the night that I actually prayed to God. I prayed to Jehovah God, and I said, okay, I will do your will for my life. And God in his amazing grace started, I'm sure he started before. This is the time I remember he actually started to step in. I remember this thought going through my head. What if God's will is for you to leave the witnesses? Now, seconds before, I banished that thought. I banished that thought as apostate pretty quickly and didn't know what was going on. I figured that was from Satan. But just before I banished that, I thought, I would have to go. I would have to follow and do his will. And it's amazing to realize that God was stepping in already. Well, so I was baptized, and this created somewhat of a shift. No longer was I just in my parents' sight and trying to live up to their expectations, but I came into the elders' line of sight as well. Things had started to calm down at home quite a bit at this point. My sister, Tracy, had grown up, and at this point she was putting her life back together. And she was able to put it back together very well. And with God's help, and actually a lot of help from people around here, she was able to put things back together. So there was still a lot of stress, but my parents were not in constant worry. There was very high expectations, and we couldn't, there was no way to meet those expectations. But my parents weren't constantly worried about her well-being and even her life. So that helped a lot with the stress. It's not easy to grow up as a Jehovah's Witness, as many of you know. School wasn't easy for me anyway. I felt like I had failed at school. I felt like I couldn't do it. You get through school and your homework, and then you have to go sit through 2 hours of meetings. The other thing that's very difficult is with the friendships. You're not supposed to make friends at school, at least not very close friends. Well, in the congregation, it had already been proven to me is that at any point, you have to be ready to turn your back on even your best friend. You have to be, and I had seen this, I watched this play out in my own family, and I knew this very well. So I didn't have a lot of friends. You couldn't really have very close friendships. You couldn't be real with people, and you had to be ready to not speak to them again. So it was lonely in that way. By this time, my other sister had also chosen to leave the witnesses. It wasn't quite as dramatic. She had already moved out of the house, so it wasn't quite as dramatic, but both of my sisters were then disfellowshipped. So that was very hard, is not being able to speak, we never were able to cut my sisters off completely. My family couldn't do it, but we weren't supposed to have this close relationship with them. And that was hard, but I thought it was what God wanted to do. So I thought that's what God wanted for me. I thought that was his will. So, but as I hit the older years, it still really affected me that I had failed the 3rd grade. And that really told me I was a failure. It was almost wearing a jacket, that I had worn this jacket of failure. I failed. It's like being printed across there. And when I hit high school, I didn't want to wear that anymore. I decided then and there to graduate with my graduating class. In our area, I don't know about yours, but high school's done in 4 years in ours. And I decided, no, I'm going to catch back up. I'm going to make up for that year, and I'm going to get through in 3 years. I don't want to be that failure. And so I went to summer school. I went to night school. I didn't have any summers the whole time growing up, and no study halls. I think I had one when I was a freshman. I think I had one study hall. And I got through high school in 3 years. But it was interesting because even though I did this to myself, it was kind of still the sink or swim. I had this need, this drive to prove I wasn't a stupid failure. I had to swim now. Before I sank, I wasn't able to swim. Now I had to. I had to make it through this. I also had to keep up with the expectations of the witnesses, which is very hard to do. And like every good witness growing up, my goal was to go to Bethel. However, I was only a sister, so I'd have to settle for pioneering. And this was my goal. And if I got through high school in 3 years, that gave me another year to pioneer. And when I did get through high school, after that time, I was able to sign up as I did sign up as a regular pioneer. That very September, I graduated in May or June, whichever one you graduate in. And that September, I signed up as a regular pioneer. Well, I don't know. If you step up at your church, if a lot of you have churches you go to, you step up and you volunteer, people are like, oh, thank you. Well, at least I hope they are. I notice in a lot of areas, if you decide to step out and serve, it's kind of, people are grateful for that. That's not the way it was as a witness. Yeah, really. Instead, you are right there in the elder's sight, and nothing I ever did pleased the elders. It was never, and I was a good kid. I was good, and I never pleased them. It was never enough. Didn't help that we had 2 elders that also full-time pioneered, so you were with them all day, every day. So I remember one time, and by this time I was an adult, I was 18, and my parents had, also encouraged me to pioneer. They didn't say I had to or anything. They did encourage it, though. And so I remember one time I had been dating somebody. And we had dated for quite a while, and we were seen someplace holding hands. We held hands. Oh my goodness, you would have thought it was the end of the world. This elder was so upset. It didn't matter that I had waited till I was 18 to ever go out on a date. It didn't matter that we had always stayed in public places, and we made sure that we did everything right there, What matters is I was wrong to hold his hand, and what did that look like to others? Another time, an elder approached me and said, I heard you were at a wedding last Sunday and you weren't at the meeting. It didn't look right. It didn't matter that I had spent the night with a friend of mine and gone to her local congregation. I was at a meeting, I really was, but it didn't look right, and I was a pioneer. Everything had to look right. So it was kind of a rough time. The elders would also use this time to be very inquisitive about how much time we spent with my sisters. My dad was an elder, and they just decided they could use me to find out anything they wanted, and they always want to know exactly how much time my sisters, we spent with them. And my sisters had kids at this point, and they had never done anything wrong, but they were always asking how much time we spent with them. My sister Kim went through a divorce and really needed a place to stay. She had 2 little boys, and there was no way my parents were going to turn her out. And so she moved in with us, but the elders hated that, and they would use, anytime I was out in service, to question about this. There was always some reason that I was not doing what or as much as I needed to do. And that's just a hard way to live, is when you feel like you're never living up to what people want from you. I was in survival mode. I was trying to keep everyone around me happy, including what I thought was God. You see, when these elders voiced their disapproval, this wasn't just somebody saying, I think you should do something different. This, to me, was God's approval. And that was not there. And I wanted so bad to please God. I really wanted to be okay with him and to love him. So this lasted for several years in that congregation, and basically, although it changed names, or for the most part, the congregation I had grown up in. Well, an opportunity came to go where the need was great, and I was able to move in with a friend, and we moved up about a half an hour away from our home. And here's when I finally had my rebellion. I did have mine. I went up there, and I met that congregation's bad boy. Oh, I really did, and I was so smitten. I still wanted to do what I was supposed to do and what was right, but in my eyes, he could do no wrong. Everyone, also actually including my parents and even my sisters, warned me about him, and I didn't listen. However, I do remember one very interesting thing. One person in the congregation said, "He's going to take you right out of the truth." Praise God. But so this was said from right away, and so after we had dated a while, we had decided, we hadn't become engaged officially, but we decided we'd get married, and I decided to stop pioneering. And it was really nice, after all these almost 5 years of pioneering, to suddenly be out of the direct limelight of the elders. That was really nice, not to have them over every single thing. That was pretty cool. But we decided to get married, and things were really tough from the get-go. First, we were very, very young. I mean, a lot of witnesses married just out of high school, and we weren't. I was a little bit older, but we were both very, very young. So things were hard. Neither of us had any education past high school. So we began to have financial problems. Financial problems. Well, it's a problem when neither of you want to work enough to pay the bills. It does tend to cause financial problems. So things were getting very hard, both in the marriage and trying. Suddenly things were different as a witness. I wasn't a pioneer anymore. It didn't always have to look just right. They didn't have as much to say. But I couldn't keep up with everything. I couldn't keep up with a struggling marriage, trying to be a witness. And again, I'm just trying to survive and keep everything together, and I couldn't. And there came a time that I really did want to end my life. I just couldn't go on. It was too painful. It was too hard. I couldn't do everything right. I couldn't please anybody, and I really felt like I couldn't please God at all. At this time in my life, I had both of my sisters, and by then, both of them were Christians. And I like to say they played good cop, bad cop. Now, if you know Tracy, you know who's the bad cop. And really, if you knew Kim, you would know that she was the good cop. So I remember laying there, and after I had gone through this, my family gathered around me and wanted to end things. Kim says, God does not want you to hurt like this. He loves you more than that. And I was still witness. And I'm like, well, and she alluded to the fact that maybe the witnesses were asking too much. And I thought, well, I'm not even doing it. Well, that's why I felt so bad about myself, is because I couldn't even do it. Other times we would visit Tracy, and I remember my ex-husband had to do some work there. So we go up there, and I'm like, now listen, whatever you do, don't leave me alone with her. She confuses me. So, of course, he goes off to do the work, and she sits down, opens this bottle of wine, pours me a glass of wine, pours herself a glass of wine, and proceeds to talk about the new meaning of the term generation. Don't you know they're wrong about this? They can't change what they believe. Well, the things she was saying started to make sense, but I was like, you know what? Of course, it had to be that wine. That's it. That glass of wine is what made that make sense. Or maybe it was Satan. Satan, that's it. It couldn't be the witnesses. But God was working here, and his grace, his awesome grace, was coming and intersecting with my life right there. Things didn't get a whole lot easier in the marriage. We really started to have worse financial problems, and we weren't going to meetings very often. Financially, we finally went to my parents for some help, and the wonderful parents they really did. They helped us out, which was awesome. But they told us, you're having these problems because you're not attending the meetings. No, we didn't really want to work enough. But anyway, so different things happened, and my ex-husband found some interesting ways to try to relieve things financially, and ended up in trouble with the elders, and actually a very painful incident for my family, but he ended up in trouble with the elders again, and he had been in front of the elders while we were dating. And so he met with them, he met with his committee, and they decided not to disfellowship him. And I thought, wow, maybe we can get things back on track. Maybe we'll do things a little better with the witnesses. Maybe we'll get back on track spiritually, so to speak. But it didn't end up to be that way. Instead, he said to me, I have questions. Well, if you have ever been a witness or know much about them, that's one of the worst things that your spouse can say to you. Here we'd been through all this pain, and I was upset and devastated because he had questions. So finally I did say, okay, what are your questions? What are they? Just tell me. And he says, well, I met with the elders this time, and I really was repentant. But the first time I met with them, I wasn't repentant. I just wanted to marry you. And I was like, oh. He says, how in the world are three men going to know what's in my heart? I can make them believe whatever I want to. And he said, and by the way, what happened in 1975? Neither of us were old enough to know anything about what happened then. And I realized then, when he said these, like my heart did something. I guess it was God because I was there. My heart did something. And I realized I had these same questions, that I had wondered about those things too. I had wondered about 1975 and never gotten a satisfactory answer. We didn't have a lot of friends because, we weren't really going to the meetings, so we didn't have friends there. We couldn't have friends in the world, so it was just us, and he had some other arguments that he brought out that made a lot of sense, he says. And I'm not putting him down. I have a little boy, and I won't try. I'm just honestly quoting. He says, I really think you're being fooled. I think we both are. He says, when I lie to you, I tell you 90 to 99% truth and just change some of the minor details, and you buy it, hook, line, and sinker. And I realized I really had, that all for many of the years in our marriage, I had, and it made me think, man, I've been gullible in this. Maybe I'm also being gullible in the witnesses. And I really do share that. That was one of the huge things that got me to think and realize I might be being pulled in on this. The other argument was that he had this friend, and they went on some wild capers. And he says, we could come up with a religion on our own. We could come up with anything and get people follow us. And this was before the days the internet was so popular. He says, we could post things on those bulletin boards. We could get followers, and then every time we mess up, we'll say, oh, we have new light. And the sad thing is I could picture this happening, and I'm like, these things really made me question. So soon, things got so bad financially, we needed a place to stay, and my sister Kim invited us to stay in her home and with her. So we stayed there till we had jobs and were back on our feet, but that took a little while. And God's grace found me right there. I still believed the witnesses had the truth, and I couldn't do it anymore. I always planned on going back to meetings, but I just couldn't do it at the time. One day, my ex pulls me aside and says, your sister, she's not evil. Which is a huge revelation. I mean, she was disfellowshipped, If you're disfellowshipped, you're evil and unhappy. And she wasn't, and she had this great group of friends, and I was like, wow, so that really struck me. I was like, and it was like my eyes were open. My sister really isn't evil. And she and Tracy had been praying for us for many years, and I know many of you here also prayed for me, and these prayers did work. We didn't know, but I was on prayer. My family and my parents and I were all on prayer lists from one end of this nation to the other, which is really awesome. And so my sisters would often talk. Oh, I'm talking fast here. My sisters would often talk about my family leaving, but they would always say, the rest of the family may leave, but Beth won't leave. I'm here. So. Do I have a few more minutes or not? Okay. So Kim ended up having back surgery that year, and it was very close to Christmas of 1997. And she had 2 little kids, and I would not touch that Christmas wrap. We were still witnesses. I wouldn't touch that Christmas wrap or those presents or anything. So, like I said, God was working on me, and the questions were swirling around on my head. Tracy comes down to wrap the presents to get them under the tree for Kim's kids, because obviously she couldn't do it. She's in the hospital. Well, you should have seen the look on Tracy's face when I took a deep breath and said, okay, tell me what happened in 1975. Tracy was ready to jump out of her skin. She was so excited. She gave me a copy of an old red book, And I was reading it, and I realized there was no way you could read that and come away with anything then the end was coming in 1975. And then I looked at some kingdom ministries that were obviously kingdom ministries. You know, it wasn't just, like I said, back then the internet wasn't so big. I can't believe how far it's come. But, you know, so it wasn't just something printed off. This was an old kingdom ministry, and old, you know, you could tell. And it blamed it right on the members. I was so shocked to believe that. So I realized I had lots of questions, and the witnesses obviously didn't have it all right. Perhaps they were right about some things. At that time, I really did feel like they probably had it right about not having a Trinity and about hell. I figured they had those things right, but they had a lot wrong, and I was getting so close to my sisters, I wasn't willing to give them up again. But I spent some time then, 2 days after Christmas, we went up to Tracy's house, and it was kind of a Christmas gathering, but they were trying to keep it quiet for us. They knew that I was having questions and that things were about to break, but they were trying not to push it. And Tracy kept saying, how about if I give you a present and don't wrap it? You know. She ended up giving us something, so she gave, believe it or not, she gave me a nice little wine rack with a bottle of wine. I think she realized. She must have realized that really worked. So we met up there, and I had spent time with my dad's family, and they were all Christians. I don't think they were when I was young, but they had become Christians by this time and were praying for us as well. And they answered some questions about, like, when my parents had first gotten married and my dad went into the witnesses on some things they had seen from their perspective. But while we were there, we watched a videotape of Tracy being on the 700 Club. And it was a really interesting story, but it really struck my heart, and I was like very saddened by it. But at the end, they say that prayer. And I don't remember the way the prayer goes now, but they do. They say, if you say this prayer, call this number. Well, I wasn't about to say it right then, but I remembered that prayer. And so that night we were back at Kim's, and I was laid in bed, and I prayed that prayer. I said, Lord, you know, I said, I want Jesus' death to cover my sin. I accept that, and I accept that gift as mine own. I told him, I said, I don't know what all these things, I don't know all the answers. I have no idea, but I would be willing to learn, even if it's not what I've been raised with. It was funny because several times before this, Kim offered to pray with me. She would keep offering to pray with me, and I wouldn't have. What? I mean, we weren't going to meetings. I didn't believe it, but I wouldn't pray with her because she was disfellowshipped. Now, praise God, just this morning, she pulls me aside, would you like to pray together? And I'm like, yes, I'd like to pray for this. So God brings things full circle. So some people are able to end their testimony right there. You know, I came to God, and that was it. Well, God's grace is wonderful, and if that's where it ended, that would have been awesome. But he did so much more. At this point, my ex-husband and I, we were still married, and both of our families were witnesses. And so not being witnesses was very difficult in front of our families, so we decided to move up to the Cleveland area. And I wouldn't talk to my parents on the phone, and so I actually would jump in the bathtub and pull the shower curtains shut, so somebody would have to tell them I was in the shower. I was scared to death of their rejection, and my heart was so torn. I saw the real truth, but I wanted their approval too. That was so important to me. So finally, my ex talked to him and says, okay, you can talk to her, but don't say anything about the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm like, you just let the cat out of the bag. Thanks for being discreet there. But God had something in mind, and the next day, I did take the phone call from my dad. And my dad said something I never heard and never known before. He says, you know, Beth, your mother and I want you to know we love you unconditionally. That's not a word in the witness's vocabulary. This blew my mind. I had never heard that. It was, you did what was right, and we love you. That's the way the witness's love is. So this blew my mind. I think by this time, my parents were already starting to have some questions in their mind, but hadn't voiced them. And maybe there was a part of them that didn't want to lose another daughter, that didn't want to lose another child. I'm not sure, but they had begun, things really started to take swing from there. And they began to question. And I was thrilled to find out that I was expecting. And even though I came to Christ, everything was still kind of chaotic around me. And my marriage was falling apart. And I didn't know how to relate to anybody around me, so I was still kind of in the survival mode, but I was watching my parents started questioning. So that was very awesome. It was a hard time, but it was also a good time. And I wasn't attending a church, but as I learned I was expecting, and this life grew inside of me, my prayer life started. Because I hadn't really been walking at that point. I had come to Christ, and, I think I needed a few months to think. But when this life started growing inside of me, my prayer life grew. My marriage was tough, and we really did fight a lot even afterwards. To say the least, probably one of the least of his worries was leaving the witnesses. So his adjustment to the outside world did not go well. He decided to join the military, and we were going to get back together after that, and we never did. I think it was a lot more appealing than having a wife and by the time my son was born, a child. So suddenly, I was a single mom. Just before my son was born, though, an amazing thing happened, and that was on Mother's Day, that my mom decided to go out to eat with my sisters and I, and we all went out for Mother's Day, and that was an amazing day. I mean, that's pretty big. I had left the witnesses by then. My sisters were both this fellowship, and she went out to eat in public with us. That was really awesome. But things were tough. My parents, this was one of their first steps to their exodus and their coming to God. And you can get their testimony too. They've given their testimony, so if you want to hear about that. So it was a hard time, and God was working in my life, but suddenly I was a single mom, and that's never easy. So God's grace broke in, and my wonderful family, who had now left the witnesses, and at some point, about a year later, came to him, all rallied around me. And I don't know what I would have done without all of my family. My parents asked me to live with them, and they said, look, you didn't go to college. We wanted you to pioneer. You can go to college and live here and rent-free and without, and it really worked out really well. So my son and I moved in with them. And I can say in one sentence, I got through college. It was 4 hard years, very hard years. You're working with the little one, trying to get him. I had to have him at daycare, up, out the door, and had him at daycare in my first class by 8 a.m. That was not easy times. But God was still working. He had brought me to him. He brought my family to him, and that wasn't enough. His grace went so much further and deeper than that in so many ways. I was still living in this survival mode. I was trying to get through school as a single mom and work and still be the primary caregiver of my son because that was very important to me. So it was hard. Well, just before I graduated, when I had absolutely no time, and I had been divorced by this time for several years, God brought somebody into my life. I won't say too much there, but Stephen is an absolute wonderful man. I have never met somebody who is a true imitator of Jesus Christ the way this person is in all of the aspects of their life. It's such a contrast to what I had ever seen before. And this was awesome. I can't believe God thought I deserved this person. And then my son and my husband, Stephen, they attached very quickly. When we started dating seriously, we took him on a picnic, and Stephen has him up on his shoulders, and my son looks down and says, "Where were you when I was 3?" So it wasn't just that I was falling in love with this man, but my son also did. And I finished college, and graduated, and had my teaching degree. And Stephen and I decided to marry. I worked the rest of that year. I graduated in December, worked the rest of that year. He's a teacher too, so 2 days after school was out, we got married. And the funny thing is, we got married, and I climbed in bed, and I slept, and I slept, and I slept. And from on and off most of the first year of our marriage, I slept. I really suddenly wasn't in the survival mode anymore. God showed me how not to be in that survival mode. And that was awesome. If he had taken this away from me right when I got saved, I wouldn't have known what to do. And I may not have made it. I really did have to work hard to get through school and everything. So I kind of needed it for a little while, but God took the survival mode. And suddenly I just started sleeping, and it all caught up to me. So God brought me so much. And I am concluding now. But this wasn't enough. Not even this was enough. Because Joan asked me to do this testimony last year. And, you go through it in your mind, and when I seriously sat down to do it, First of all, it's not easy to do when your family's here. So I love having my family here. I wouldn't trade it for the world because I'm happy they're here. That God is so good. But to explain it all, I'm a peacekeeper, so to explain this all wasn't easy. But more than that, as I went through and tried to come up with the words to say, I was suddenly taken back to all that pain. I didn't have time to process it before, I guess. But each of these stages, whether it was that third grader who was the failure, or the teenager who was just trying to get close to God, or the pioneer, I went through all of those painful things again. But God had a plan for even that. It wasn't enough that he saved me. It wasn't enough he took me out of survival mode. It wasn't enough that his grace brought my whole family out of the witnesses into him. He wanted to heal. And as I went through each of these things, they would come up and I would cry and cry. And I finally met with somebody in my church, this wonderful lady. She's an older lady, has been a Christian for many years. And we just started praying through each one. And God came in and he healed each one. And he's given me such a peace over these. So this, even right down to giving this testimony, God has been so good. His grace goes that far. So I do encourage you that if you've left the witnesses or any other cult, no matter how long it's been, if it's been 10 or 20 years, it doesn't matter. If it's been a year or 6 months, if you are still hurting, don't just push that pain down or wait for something to bring it up. Grab somebody, meet with a counselor or a Christian counselor, or meet with someone in your church, or just grab a friend and say, hey, and pray through those things where God wants to heal. His grace goes so deep, and he wants to heal all those things. God's grace has done so much. My whole family is a living testimony of that. If any of you are sitting here with people in your life that are still witnesses, if you're praying for them and you think that you'll never come out, I was that one. My sister said she will never come out. And I did. I'm here. And more than that, God's grace has done so many things in my life. And I just am so thankful for God. As my sister said a long time ago, I encourage you to get healing if there's anything for that, because for the things that had happened, because as my sister said a long time ago, God loves you more than that. And he doesn't want you to be in that pain. So my family is very close, and I know my family has been very close since we left the witnesses. We get together for every single holiday and for all sorts of other times. My parents often have all 4 children out of their house on the same day. As many of you know, we had a terrible tragedy in my family, and this especially with Tracy's oldest child, firstborn child. And I would just ask, if God leads you so, to stand with my family as we pray for her to get through this time. There's no way to handle this well. There's no way that she's going to be okay with this. I just ask you to pray, to stand. Oh, I don't mean really stand. I could have been just stand with us in prayer, and I just ask you to pray for her as she deals with this time. I know she's precious to many of you here, and she could just use your prayers, and as my family, and I pray for her to get through this time. Thank you.
That was worth waiting for. What a gracious, wonderful God we have. Thank you so much, Beth. Well, it's time.